The baby monitor crackled with desperate cries at 3 a.m. Their 8-month-old son was burning with fever, struggling to breathe. But when Sophia Sterling called her billionaire husband for help, his response changed everything. "It's just a baby being a baby. I'll check on you later." He hung up to return to his champagne celebration with his mistress. What Jackson Sterling didn't know was that his dismissive words had just awakened a sleeping giant. By sunrise, the empire he was toasting would have a new queen, and the woman he'd underestimated would become his greatest nightmare. This is the story of how one devastating phone call brought down a real estate mogul and gave birth to a business empire built on justice. If you think you know how this ends, you don't. But first, if you love stories where the underdog wins, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of justice and revenge. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The baby monitor crackled to life at 3:17 in the morning, piercing the silence of the Sterling penthouse with Connor's fevered cries. Sophia Sterling bolted upright, her maternal instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. This wasn't the usual fussing of an 8-month-old. This was different. Desperate. She rushed to the nursery, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. Connor lay in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. His skin burned against her palm when she touched his forehead. 104 degrees. "Jackson," she called out, her voice echoing through their Manhattan penthouse. No response. She remembered then he was at the Sterling Properties IPO celebration, the biggest night of his career. But this was bigger. This was their son. With trembling fingers, she dialed his number. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, and she could hear the sound of clinking glasses and laughter in the background. "Sophia, this better be important. I'm in the middle of my speech." "Jackson, Connor's burning up. His fever is 104, and he's struggling to breathe. I think we need to go to the emergency room." A heavy sigh came through the phone. "Did you give him Tylenol?" "Yes, but Jackson, this is serious. I'm scared. Can you come home?" "Sophia, you're being dramatic. It's just a baby being a baby. Kids get fevers all the time. I'll check on you when I get home." The line went dead. Sophia stared at her phone, Jackson's words echoing in her mind. Just a baby. Their son was just a baby to him. Not Connor. Not their child who could barely breathe. Just a baby. She wrapped Connor in a blanket and grabbed her keys. As she waited for the elevator, she thought about how they'd met 5 years ago. Jackson Sterling, the charismatic real estate mogul who'd swept her off her feet. She'd been a rising star at Goldman Sachs then, handling multi-million-dollar portfolios. He'd promised her the world, told her they'd build an empire together. Instead, she'd built his empire while losing herself in the process. The emergency room at Mount Sinai was a controlled chaos of beeping machines and urgent whispers. Dr. Sarah Collins, her old college roommate, happened to be on duty. One look at Connor and Sarah's expression turned grave. "Sophia, this is pneumonia. His oxygen saturation is dropping. We need to get him on respiratory support immediately." As the medical team rushed Connor into treatment, Sophia called Jackson again. Voicemail. She tried 3 more times. Each call went straight to voicemail. Hours later, as Connor slept peacefully with an oxygen mask over his tiny face, Sophia's phone buzzed with a text from Jackson. "How's the little guy heading home soon? Amazing night for the company." She didn't reply. Instead, she opened Instagram, something she rarely did anymore. The first story that appeared was from Madison Hayes, Jackson's 26-year-old assistant. The timestamp showed it was posted 2 hours ago. The image made her blood freeze. Jackson and Madison on a rooftop terrace, champagne glasses raised. the city skyline glittering behind them. Madison's caption read, "Perfect night with my favorite CEO. Some celebrations are worth everything." This wasn't a company party. This was a date. Her marriage wasn't just broken. It was a lie. As she sat in that sterile hospital room, watching her son fight for each breath, something cold and calculating settled in her chest. Jackson had made his choice. He'd chosen champagne and his mistress over his dying child. Now Sophia would make hers. Connor spent 3 days in the hospital. During those 72 hours, Jackson visited exactly once, staying for 20 minutes before claiming he had an urgent business call. He didn't hold his son. He didn't speak to the doctors. He scrolled through his phone and complained about the hospital coffee. "This is costing us a fortune," he muttered, eyeing the medical equipment. "Can't we move him to a regular room?" "He needs respiratory monitoring," Sophia said quietly. Dr. Collins is milking this for all it's worth. Doctors always do." After he left, promising to return later but never showing up, Sophia made a decision. She was going to find out exactly what her husband had been hiding. Back home with a recovering Connor. She waited until Jackson left for his morning run. He'd always been obsessively punctual about his exercise routine, exactly 45 minutes, every day at 7 a.m. It gave her a window. His laptop sat on his desk in their home office, password protected but not from her. He'd never changed it from their wedding date, too arrogant to imagine she'd ever snoop. The man who'd built a real estate empire worth $300 million used their anniversary as his password. What she found made her stomach turn. Email after email between Jackson and Madison, dating back 8 months. Hotel reservations, jewelry purchases, apartment rentals. But it wasn't just the affair that shocked her, it was the money trail. Jackson had been funneling company funds through a subsidiary called Sterling Holdings, a shell company he'd created without board approval. Madison's rent, Madison's car payments, Madison's shopping sprees. Even the earrings Sophia had found in Jackson's Mercedes, a $5,000 pair from Tiffany, charged to client entertainment. She screenshot everything, her hands shaking as the scope of his betrayal became clear. This wasn't just adultery. This was embezzlement on a massive scale. The door opened downstairs. Jackson was back early. Sophia closed the laptop and rushed to Connor's nursery, scooping up their son as Jackson's footsteps echoed up the stairs. "How's my boy?" Jackson asked, appearing in the doorway. But he was looking at his phone, not at Connor. "He's better. The antibiotics are working." "Good. I need you to sign some papers later, just routine stuff for the trust fund." Sophia's blood chilled. "What kind of papers?" "Nothing major, just updating the beneficiaries, making sure everything's in order." She knew what that meant. He was preparing to divorce her, and he wanted her to sign away her rights without realizing it. That evening, after Jackson left for another board meeting, Sophia called the one person she thought might help her. Rick Davidson had been Jackson's CFO for 5 years and his best friend since college. If anyone knew about the financial irregularities, it would be Rick. They met at a quiet coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from Manhattan's watchful eyes. Rick looked exhausted, older than his 45 years. "I've been waiting for this call," he said before Sophia could speak. "I wondered when you'd figure it out. You know about Madison. I know about everything. The shell company, the false invoices, the way he's been bleeding money from Sterling Properties. I've been documenting it all. Why haven't you reported him?" Rick's laugh was bitter. "To who the board half of them owe Jackson favors. The SEC, I need more evidence than just altered books. He's smart, Sophia. He's been careful to keep his name off most of the transactions. But you have proof. Enough to destroy him. The question is, are you ready for war? Because that's what this will be. Jackson doesn't lose gracefully. Sophia thought of Connor's tiny face behind the oxygen mask, of Jackson's dismissive words, of Madison's triumphant Instagram story. "I'm ready," she said. "Tell me what you need." But as they spoke, neither of them noticed the man at the corner table, the one who'd been photographing their conversation through his phone. By the time they parted ways, Jackson already knew about their meeting. The war had begun, and Sophia didn't even know she was already losing. Sophia spent the next week preparing for battle. She documented everything: the financial discrepancies Rick had shown her, the timeline of Jackson's affair, even the medical records from Connor's hospitalization. Her old Wall Street training kicked in as she built her case like she'd once built investment portfolios, methodically, ruthlessly, with backup plans for every contingency. She found Elena Martinez through a friend's recommendation. Elena was a divorce attorney with a reputation for taking down powerful men who thought they were untouchable. Her office in Midtown was all glass and steel, much like the woman herself. "Your husband is Jackson Sterling," Elena said, reviewing the documents Sophia had brought. "This won't be simple. He has resources, connections, and from what you've shown me, a complete willingness to play dirty. I have evidence of embezzlement." "Good, but it's not enough. We need to catch him in the act, not just prove he did it in the past. And we need to move fast. Men like Jackson don't wait for their wives to file first." Elena was right. That evening, Jackson came home with divorce papers already drawn up. "I think we need some time apart," he said, sliding the documents across their dining room table like he was presenting a business proposal. "This is fair. You'll get the house in the Hamptons, enough money to live comfortably, and joint custody of Connor." Sophia read through the agreement, her lawyer's training serving her well. It was anything but fair. She'd get less than 5% of their assets, and the custody arrangement gave Jackson primary residence. "What if I don't sign?" Jackson's smile was cold. "Then things get messy. And Sophia, you don't want things to get messy. You've been struggling since Connor was born. Postpartum depression can make a woman do unpredictable things." The threat was clear: sign willingly, or he'd have her declared mentally unfit. "I need time to think about it." "You have until Friday. That's 3 days. After he left for another late meeting, Sophia called Elena. "He's forcing a timeline," she told her lawyer. "We need to move now. I've been making calls. There's a board meeting scheduled for next week. If Rick can present his evidence then, we might be able to freeze Jackson's assets before he can hide them." But when Sophia tried to call Rick, his phone went straight to voicemail. She tried his office. His secretary said he'd called in sick. By Thursday, she was worried enough to drive to his apartment in Queens. The building superintendent let her in after she explained she was Rick's friend and hadn't heard from him in days. What they found made her knees buckle. Rick's apartment had been ransacked, papers scattered everywhere, his computer missing, but no signs of a struggle. On his kitchen table was a resignation letter, typed but not signed. "Looks like your friend skipped town," the superintendent said. "Happens more than you'd think. Guy gets in trouble, decides to run." But Sophia knew better. Rick wouldn't have run. He'd been too angry, too determined to see Jackson brought down. This was Jackson's work. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Rick says hello. He's taking a long vacation. You should consider doing the same, for Connor's sake." She drove home in a daze, her carefully laid plans crumbling around her. Without Rick, she had no inside knowledge of the company's finances. Without his testimony, her evidence was circumstantial at best. When she walked into their penthouse, Jackson was waiting in the living room with 2 men she didn't recognize. They wore expensive suits, but had the hard eyes of people who solved problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels. "Sophia, we need to talk," Jackson said. "These gentlemen are from a private security firm. They're concerned about some erratic behavior you've been exhibiting." "What are you talking about?" One of the men stepped forward. "Mrs. Sterling, we understand you've been under a lot of stress, following your husband, making wild accusations, meeting with his business associates to spread false rumors. These are signs of someone who needs professional help." The setup was elegant and terrifying. Jackson wasn't just trying to discredit her, he was building a case for having her committed. In New York, a spouse could petition for involuntary psychiatric hold if they could prove the person was a danger to themselves or others. "Where's Connor?" she asked, suddenly realizing her son wasn't in his usual playpen. "Safe," Jackson said, "with his grandmother, until you get the help you need." Sophia understood then that she'd been outmaneuvered completely. Jackson had Rick. He had Connor. He had witnesses prepared to testify that she was mentally unstable. All she had were documents that proved nothing without Rick's testimony. She looked at the divorce papers still sitting on the coffee table, then at the men flanking her husband. The message was a clear sign now, or lose everything. But as she reached for the pen, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Don't sign anything. Help is coming. Trust no one. A friend." Sophia's hand froze over the papers. Someone was still fighting for her. She just had to survive long enough to find out who. Sophia didn't sign the papers that night. Instead, she told Jackson she needed one more day to think, playing the part of the confused, overwhelmed wife he expected her to be. It bought her 12 hours, but at a devastating cost. The next morning, she woke to find her credit cards canceled, her bank accounts frozen, and her cell phone service disconnected. Jackson had moved with surgical precision, cutting off every financial lifeline she had. When she tried to leave the penthouse, the doorman politely informed her that Mr. Sterling had asked him to keep track of her comings and goings for her own safety. She was a prisoner in her own home. The isolation was psychological warfare, and Jackson was a master at it. He came and went freely, often with Madison in tow, making no effort to hide their relationship now that he held all the cards. "This is temporary," he told Sophia over breakfast, buttering his toast as if discussing the weather. "Once you sign the papers and get some help, things will go back to normal. I want to see Connor soon, when you're feeling better." That afternoon, while Jackson was at the office, Sophia found a prepaid phone hidden in their bedroom, the unknown number that had texted her. She called it immediately. "Thank God," came Elena Martinez's voice. "I was starting to think they'd gotten to you too." "Elena, how did you—" "I have my ways. Listen carefully. We don't have much time. Jackson's moving faster than we anticipated. He's planning to have you committed tomorrow morning. I've seen the paperwork." Sophia's blood turned to ice. "On what grounds?" "He has 3 witnesses prepared to testify that you've been stalking Madison, making threats, behaving erratically. Dr. Pemberton from Bellevue is standing by to sign the commitment order." "But none of that is true." "Truth doesn't matter when you have the right witnesses and the right doctor. But Sophia, there's something else. Something Jackson doesn't know I know." Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. "James Mitchell has been calling me. Jackson's own father wants to meet with you." James Mitchell had been a legend on Wall Street before retiring to run the family foundation. He was also the chairman of Sterling Properties' board of directors, though he'd supposedly stepped back from day-to-day operations. If he was reaching out, it meant Jackson's own father had turned against him. "Where and when? Tonight, midnight. The old pier at South Street Seaport. Come alone. And Sophia, bring everything you have. This is our only shot." The hours crawled by until midnight. Jackson was out with Madison, probably celebrating his imminent victory. Sophia slipped out through the service elevator, her heart pounding as she made her way through the empty streets of Manhattan. James Mitchell was waiting at the end of the pier, a tall, distinguished man who looked like an older version of Jackson, but with kind eyes instead of cold calculation. "You're braver than I expected," he said without preamble. "Most people would have signed those papers by now." "Connor is my son. I won't abandon him." James nodded approvingly. Jackson never understood that. The idea that someone could love something more than they fear losing it. He handed her a thick envelope. "That's everything I've been able to gather. Financial records, board communications, evidence of Jackson's embezzlement that goes back 3 years. Why are you helping me? Because Jackson stopped being my son the moment he chose greed over family. And because I know what he's planning to do to you tomorrow." They talked for an hour, James explaining how Jackson had been systematically looting the company while positioning himself as its savior. The IPO celebration had been funded with stolen money. Madison's lifestyle was being bankrolled by pension funds from Sterling Properties employees. "But here's what Jackson doesn't know," James said, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "The board votes on Monday to approve his promotion to chairman. If we can present this evidence before that vote, we can destroy him completely." Sophia felt hope flickering to life for the first time in days. "What do you need me to do?" "Survive until Monday. Don't let him commit you. Whatever it takes. Stay free for 4 more days." But as they parted ways, neither of them saw the telephoto lens capturing their meeting from a building across the street. By the time Sophia made it back to the penthouse, Jackson was waiting. "Interesting evening walk," he said, holding up a tablet showing the photos. "My security team is very thorough." The trap had been baited perfectly. Jackson had known about James Mitchell's involvement all along. The meeting wasn't hope, it was the final nail in her coffin. "The commitment hearing is moved to 8 a.m. tomorrow," Jackson continued. "I have photos of you meeting with a man in the middle of the night, evidence of your erratic behavior, and now proof that you're involving my father in your delusions." Sophia realized with crystal clarity that she'd been played from the beginning. Rick's disappearance, the anonymous text, even Elena's involvement, Jackson had orchestrated it all to make her look increasingly unstable. She had lost everything, and tomorrow she would lose her freedom too. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she remembered something Jackson had forgotten. Before she was Mrs. Sterling, before she was Connor's mother, she had been Sophia Chen, the woman who'd never lost an investment, who'd built portfolios worth hundreds of millions, who'd earned her reputation by being smarter than everyone else in the room. Jackson was about to learn that the most dangerous opponent is the one with nothing left to lose. The commitment hearing was scheduled for 8 a.m. at Bellevue Hospital. At 6:30, 2 orderlies arrived at the Sterling penthouse with legal paperwork and restraints, prepared to escort Sophia to what Jackson believed would be her final defeat. But Sophia wasn't there. She'd left at 4 a.m., slipping out through the building's loading dock using a route she'd memorized during her days of isolation. Elena Martinez had provided more than just a prepaid phone. She'd given Sophia an escape plan that had been months in the making. The safe house was a modest apartment in Brooklyn, rented under a false name and stocked with everything Sophia needed to wage her final campaign. Elena was waiting with coffee and a grim smile. "Jackson will realize you're gone by 7, Elena said. "That gives us exactly 24 hours before he can get a warrant issued for your arrest as a fugitive mental patient. That's not much time. It's enough, because while Jackson was playing psychological games, I was building a real case. And Sophia? I wasn't working alone. The door opened, and Dr. Sarah Collins walked in, followed by a man Sophia didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Sophia, meet FBI Special Agent David Chen, Elena said. No relation, despite the name. He's been investigating Sterling Properties for securities fraud. Agent Chen sat across from her, his expression serious. Mrs. Sterling, your husband's company has been on our radar for 2 years. We suspected financial irregularities, but we needed an insider to confirm our suspicions. Rick Davidson was going to help you. Rick Davidson is fine, Agent Chen said, and Sophia's heart leaped. He's been in witness protection for the past week. The apartment you found was staged. We needed Jackson to think he'd eliminated his only threat. The revelation hit her like a thunderbolt. Rick was alive. The evidence still existed. The game wasn't over. But we need more than financial records, Agent Chen continued. We need Jackson to incriminate himself, and that's where you come in. Dr. Sarah leaned forward. Sophia, I kept something from you at the hospital. When Jackson visited Connor, he made some statements about the baby's condition that were illuminating. I recorded them, but they're not enough on their own. She played the audio on her phone, Jackson's voice, cold and calculating. How long do we have to keep this up? The kid's fine now, right? Good. I need this drama to stop. It's interfering with my plans. He was talking about Connor's illness like it was an inconvenience, Dr. Sarah explained. But we need him to say more, something that proves he's been using his son's medical emergency as cover for his other activities. Elena pulled out a complex legal document. Here's what we're going to do. I'm filing an emergency custody motion this morning, claiming you've discovered evidence of child endangerment. Jackson will be forced to respond publicly, and his ego won't let him stay quiet. But won't that just give him another chance to paint me as unstable? That's what he'll think. But Agent Chen will be recording everything, and this time, we'll have backup. The plan was audacious. They would force Jackson into a public custody battle, knowing his narcissism would compel him to defend himself in increasingly damaging ways. Every statement he made would be recorded, every financial claim would be scrutinized, and every lie would become evidence against him. At exactly 9 a.m., Elena filed the emergency motion at family court. By 10, news vans were gathered outside the Sterling Properties building. By 11, Jackson was giving an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps, his face red with fury. My wife is suffering from severe postpartum depression, he declared to the cameras. She's been making wild accusations about our finances, stalking my employees, and putting our son at risk with her erratic behavior. I'm doing everything I can to get her the help she needs. Agent Chen, watching from across the street, smiled as his recording equipment captured every word. Jackson was walking directly into their trap. The money she's claiming I misappropriated was used for legitimate business purposes, Jackson continued, his voice rising. Every penny can be accounted for, and I have the records to prove it. It was exactly what they needed him to say. Because the records Jackson was referring to were the falsified documents Rick had been creating under FBI supervision for months, Jackson had just publicly committed to producing evidence of his own crimes. But as Sophia watched the press conference from the safe house, her phone buzzed with a text that made her blood freeze. Mommy's been very naughty. Come home now, or Connor pays the price. You have 1 hour, Jay. The game had just changed again. Jackson had their son, and Sophia realized that no matter how clever their plan was, a desperate man with nothing to lose was the most dangerous opponent of all. Elena saw her face and immediately understood. He has Connor. I have to go back. It's a trap. Sophia, the moment you show up, he'll have you committed and disappear with Connor. You'll never see your son again. Agent Chen was already on his phone, coordinating with his team. We can't get a warrant to search for Connor without more evidence, and Jackson's smart enough to have moved him somewhere we can't track. Sophia looked at the three people who'd risked everything to help her, then at the evidence that could destroy Jackson Sterling forever. She had to choose between justice and her son. There was no choice at all. I'm going back, she said, standing up. But I'm not going back empty-handed. Sophia walked into the Sterling Properties building at exactly noon, every camera and reporter in the city watching her approach. She'd chosen to make her return as public as possible, knowing that Jackson couldn't simply disappear her with the world watching. The lobby was packed with FBI agents, reporters, and building security. Agent Chen had managed to get a surveillance warrant based on Jackson's press conference, which meant everything happening in the building was being recorded by federal law enforcement. Jackson was waiting for her in his corner office, Connor sleeping peacefully in a portable crib beside his desk. The sight of her son, safe and unharmed, nearly brought Sophia to her knees with relief. Smart move, Jackson said, not looking up from his computer. Coming back publicly, but it doesn't change anything. You're still going to Bellevue, and Connor's still going to live with his father. Actually, Jackson, I think you'll find that's changed. Elena Martinez walked into the office, followed by Agent Chen and two federal marshals. Jackson's confident smile faltered for the first time. Jackson Sterling, Agent Chen said, pulling out his badge. You're under arrest for securities fraud, embezzlement, and wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent. This is harassment, Jackson snarled, standing up so quickly his chair toppled backward. I'll have your badge for this. Sir, please step away from the child, one of the marshals said, moving toward Connor's crib. That's when Jackson made his fatal mistake. Instead of remaining calm and calling his lawyers, his narcissism took control. You people have no idea what you're dealing with, he shouted, pointing at Sophia. I built this empire from nothing. I own half the politicians in this city. You think some documents and a hysterical woman are going to bring me down? Agent Chen smiled as his recording device captured every word. Mr. Sterling, are you saying you have inappropriate relationships with public officials? I'm saying I have the juice to make all of you disappear. The mayor owes me favors. The police commissioner plays golf at my club. Hell, I've got judges who... Jackson, stop talking, Elena said, but he was beyond listening. Who've been taking my money for years. You want a war, I'll give you a war. Sophia thinks she's smart, but she has no idea how deep this goes. Each word was another nail in his coffin. Jackson was confessing to corruption, bribery, and conspiracy on federal recording devices in front of multiple witnesses, with his own son as an audience. Mr. Sterling, Agent Chen said calmly, you're making this much worse for yourself. Worse, I own this city. I own people like you. Do you know how many federal judges I've contributed to? How many senators I've helped elect? Rick Davidson chose that moment to walk through the office door, very much alive and carrying a box of financial records. Jackson's face went white. Hello, Jackson, Rick said quietly. I brought those documents you wanted. The psychological impact was devastating. Jackson had been so certain Rick was dead that seeing him alive shattered his last grip on reality. He lunged toward Rick, screaming about betrayal and conspiracies, while the federal marshals tackled him to the ground. As Jackson was handcuffed and read his rights, Sophia scooped Connor from his crib, holding her son close as her husband was led away in chains. Connor woke up and smiled at her, completely unaware that his world had just shifted forever. "Is it over?" Sophia asked Elena as they watched Jackson being escorted through the lobby in handcuffs, reporters shouting questions and cameras flashing. "The criminal case is just beginning," Elena replied. "But the custody battle is finished. After today's performance, no judge in the country would give Jackson access to Connor." Agent Chen approached them, looking satisfied. "Mrs. Sterling, your husband just confessed to more crimes than we were investigating. We'll need you to testify, but I can guarantee he's going to prison for a very long time." Through the office windows, they could see the news vans broadcasting live coverage of Jackson Sterling's arrest. The man who'd built an empire on lies and stolen money was being destroyed by his own arrogance, exactly as Sophia had known he would be. But as she held Connor and watched her husband's world crumble, Sophia felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion and a quiet determination to build something better from the ashes. The war was over. Now came the harder task of winning the peace. The federal investigation into Jackson Sterling's crimes moved with startling speed. Within 48 hours of his arrest, FBI agents had seized his computers, frozen his accounts, and uncovered a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of New York politics. Sophia found herself at the center of a media hurricane. Her face was on every news program, her story told and retold until it became legend. "The woman who brought down Jackson Sterling" was how the headlines read, but the reality was more complex and painful than any news story could capture. The Sterling Properties building was crawling with federal agents and forensic accountants. They'd found evidence of embezzlement totaling over $50 million. Most of it funneled through shell companies to fund Jackson's lifestyle and his affair with Madison Hayes. Madison herself had disappeared the moment news of Jackson's arrest broke. Her apartment was empty, her social media accounts deleted, her phone disconnected. She'd taken the money Jackson had given her and vanished, leaving him to face the consequences alone. "Smart girl," Elena commented as they reviewed the latest FBI findings. She knew when to cut and run. Sophia sat in Elena's office, Connor playing quietly on a blanket beside her chair. The past week had been a blur of FBI interviews, court appearances, and custody hearings. Jackson was being held without bail, deemed a flight risk after agents discovered he'd already moved $20 million to offshore accounts. "What happens now?" Sophia asked. "Now you rebuild," Elena said. "The court has granted you full custody of Connor and awarded you 60% of the legitimate Sterling Properties assets. After restitution to the pension funds and other victims, you're looking at approximately $40 million. It was more money than Sophia had ever dreamed of having, but it felt hollow. She'd never wanted Jackson's money. She'd wanted her family intact and her son safe. "There's something else," Elena continued. "James Mitchell has made you an offer. He wants you to take over as CEO of Sterling Properties." Sophia looked up in surprise. "Me, I don't know anything about running a construction company." "You know more than you think. You built portfolios worth hundreds of millions at Goldman Sachs. You understand finance. You understand leadership. And most importantly, you understand integrity. The company needs someone who can restore trust after Jackson's betrayal." The idea was terrifying and tempting in equal measure. Sterling Properties had been Jackson's kingdom, but it had been built on her hidden contributions and the work of honest employees like Rick Davidson. Maybe it was time for those people to have a leader who valued them. "I need time to think about it." "Take all the time you need. But Sophia, remember what Jackson said to you the night Connor was in the hospital? He said it was just a baby. Well, this company isn't just a business. It's the livelihood of 300 families. They need someone who understands that not everything in life is just anything." That evening, Sophia sat in her new apartment, a modest place in Brooklyn, far from the marble palaces she'd shared with Jackson. Connor was asleep in his crib, breathing easily and healthily. She'd kept the same pediatrician, Dr. Sarah Collins, who'd become more of a friend than a doctor through their ordeal. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. Mrs. Sterling. This is Rick Davidson. I hope you don't mind me calling. Rick. Of course not. How are you holding up? Better now that Jackson's behind bars. I wanted to thank you for what you did. If you hadn't fought back, he would have destroyed the company and stolen everyone's pensions. You're the one who gathered the evidence. I just survived long enough for it to matter. About that, Rick said, his voice hesitant. I heard James Mitchell offered you the CEO position. I think you should take it. I don't know if I'm qualified. Sophia, I watched Jackson run that company for 5 years. He made decisions based on ego and greed. You make decisions based on what's right. That's the only qualification that matters. After they hung up, Sophia walked to Connor's crib and watched her son sleep. In the morning, she would call James Mitchell and accept his offer. Not because she wanted to run a company, but because Jackson had been right about one thing. She did build the world, one decision at a time, and she intended to build a better one than the man who'd once called their son just a baby. 6 months after Jackson Sterling's arrest, Sophia stood in the boardroom of what was now called Sterling Mitchell Properties, addressing the company's employees for the first time as CEO. The room was packed with construction workers, architects, accountants, and project managers, people whose livelihoods had been threatened by Jackson's crimes. I know many of you are wondering what happens next, she began, looking out at faces that showed a mixture of hope and skepticism. Some of you worked with Jackson for years. Some of you trusted him. All of you deserve better than what he gave you. She'd spent the past 6 months learning every aspect of the business, working 18-hour days to understand construction law, building codes, and project management. It was harder than anything she'd done at Goldman Sachs, but also more rewarding. The federal investigation is complete, she continued. All stolen pension funds have been restored with interest. Every employee will receive their full benefits. And we're implementing new oversight procedures to ensure this never happens again. A hand went up in the back of the room. What about the Lakeside project? Jackson had us $40 million over budget on that one. Sophia had been dreading this question. The Lakeside residential development was Jackson's pet project, luxury condos built on environmentally sensitive wetlands. The permits had been obtained through bribes, the environmental studies falsified, and the construction was shoddy enough to be dangerous. We're shutting it down, she said, and the room erupted in concerned murmurs. I know that means laying off some crews temporarily, but I won't put our name on buildings that could collapse or our workers in legal jeopardy. What about the money we've already invested? It's gone, Sophia said bluntly. Jackson's corruption tainted every aspect of that project. But I have good news. We've been approved for the Green Harbor Initiative affordable housing built to the highest environmental standards. It's a 3-year project that will employ twice as many people as Lakeside ever would have. The mood in the room shifted as she explained the new project. Instead of luxury condos for the wealthy, they'd be building homes for teachers, firefighters, and working families. Instead of cutting corners to maximize profit, they'd be setting new standards for sustainable construction. Rick Davidson, now promoted to CFO with a substantial raise, stood up to address the room. I've seen the numbers on Green Harbor. This isn't charity, it's good business. We'll make a healthy profit while building something the community actually needs. After the meeting, Sophia retreated to her office, the same space Jackson had occupied, but completely transformed. Gone were the ego wall of photos and meaningless awards. In their place were architectural models of their current projects and a large window overlooking a daycare center where Connor spent his mornings while she worked. Elena Martinez knocked on her door, holding a thick legal file. Jackson's sentencing hearing is next week. 15 to 20 years is the expected range. Sophia nodded, but didn't feel the satisfaction she'd expected. Jackson's imprisonment wouldn't undo the damage he'd caused or bring back the years she'd lost to his manipulation. "There's something else," Elena continued. Madison Hayes surfaced in the Bahamas. She's agreed to return the money Jackson gave her in exchange for immunity from prosecution. How much? $3.7 million. She spent the rest. Sophia almost laughed. Madison had thrown away her life for money that could have bought a nice house, but not the lifestyle she'd craved. It seemed fitting, somehow. "What about Jackson? Has he said anything about Connor?" "He's requested visitation rights. I recommend we refuse. The psychological evaluation shows he's incapable of putting Connor's needs before his own ego." That evening, Sophia picked up Connor from daycare and drove to their new home, a modest house in Park Slope, with a small yard where Connor could play safely. It wasn't a penthouse, but it was theirs, bought with money she'd earned honestly. As she gave Connor his bath, her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Collins. "Saw the news about the Green Harbor project. Connor's going to be proud of his mom someday." Sophia smiled, thinking about the future she was building for her son. Not a life of wealth built on lies and stolen money, but something more valuable, a foundation of integrity that could support whatever dreams he chose to pursue. Jackson had called Connor just a baby, as if his son's life had no significance. But Connor wasn't just anything. He was the reason Sophia had found the strength to fight back, the motivation to build something better from the ruins of her marriage. In the morning, she would go to Jackson's sentencing hearing, not for revenge, but for closure. The man who'd once controlled every aspect of her life would learn exactly how much his arrogance had cost him. But tonight, she was simply a mother giving her son a bath, building the kind of ordinary, precious moments that Jackson had never understood were worth more than any empire. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was packed with reporters, victims, and curious onlookers for Jackson Sterling's sentencing hearing. Sophia sat in the front row with Connor on her lap, flanked by Elena Martinez and Agent Chen. She debated whether to attend, but ultimately decided she needed to see this chapter close. Jackson looked smaller than she remembered. The expensive suits had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, and the arrogant confidence that had once defined him was gone. When their eyes met across the courtroom, she saw not the man who'd once intimidated her, but someone broken by his own choices. Federal Judge Rebecca Martinez. No relation to Elena, had a reputation for tough sentencing. She'd reviewed every aspect of Jackson's crimes over the past hour, detailing the scope of his embezzlement and the lives he'd damaged. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Martinez said, looking down at him with barely concealed disgust, "you've pleaded guilty to 17 federal charges, including securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and bribery. You stole from pension funds, defrauded investors, and corrupted public officials, but perhaps most damaging, you betrayed the trust of 300 employees who believed you cared about their welfare." Jackson's lawyer had presented a mitigation case focusing on his charitable work and family responsibilities, but it fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Rick Davidson had testified about the systematic theft, Agent Chen had detailed the corruption, and several victims had given impact statements about losing their life savings to Jackson's schemes. "Before I impose sentence," Judge Martinez continued, "I'm going to allow the victims to address you directly. Mrs. Sterling, you've indicated you'd like to speak." Sophia stood up, handing Connor to Elena. She'd written a speech, but decided to speak from the heart instead. "Jackson," she said, her voice steady and clear. "For 5 years, you made me believe I was small. You convinced me that my thoughts didn't matter. My career was disposable, and my instincts were wrong. You made me feel like I was just a wife, just a mother, just someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you gave me." Jackson stared at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "The night our son was dying in the hospital, you told me he was just a baby. That's when I realized you saw everyone in your life as just a wife, just employees, just obstacles to what you wanted. But there's no such thing as just a human being. Jackson, every person you hurt was someone's entire world." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I don't forgive you, and I don't hate you. I pity you. Because while you were busy building an empire of lies, the rest of us were building actual lives. Connor will grow up knowing his mother fought for what was right, even when it was terrifying. The employees you tried to cheat will keep their jobs and their dignity. The families you would have displaced are living in homes we built honestly." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "You called our son just a baby, but that baby inspired me to tear down everything you built and create something better. Your legacy is a federal prison sentence. Mine is a company that treats people with respect and a son who will never doubt that he matters." She sat down to silence in the courtroom. Jackson was crying now, finally understanding the scope of what he'd lost. Judge Martinez imposed the maximum sentence, 22 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 18 years. Jackson would be 60 years old before he could even hope for freedom, and Connor would be a grown man who barely remembered his father. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions at Sophia, but she ignored them. Elena shepherded her and Connor into a waiting car, and they drove away from Jackson Sterling's final public humiliation. "How do you feel?" Elena asked. "Empty," Sophia admitted. "I thought I'd feel more satisfied." "Justice isn't about satisfaction," Elena replied. "It's about consequences. Jackson will spend the next 2 decades thinking about what he lost. You get to spend them building what you've gained." That evening, Sophia sat in Connor's nursery, reading him a bedtime story about a little engine that could overcome any obstacle through determination and hard work. Connor was walking now, chattering in the half-words of an 18-month-old, completely unaware that his father was gone forever. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rick Davidson. Board approved the Springfield School renovation project. 6 months of work for 40 people. You're changing lives. Sophia. She smiled, thinking about the elementary school they'd be rebuilding in Queens, the same neighborhood where she'd grown up. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. Children would learn in classrooms that were safe, warm, and built to last. Jackson had measured success in dollars and headlines. Sophia was learning to measure it in the lives they touched and the integrity they maintained. She was building an empire too, but one based on creating value instead of extracting it. As she tucked Connor into his crib, he looked up at her with eyes that held complete trust and love. He would never know a world where his mother was afraid, where his needs came second to someone else's ego, or where his worth was measured by someone else's standards. "Good night, baby," she whispered, kissing his forehead. He wasn't just a baby. He was her son, her inspiration, and her reminder that the smallest lives often carry the greatest significance. 2 years after Jackson Sterling's sentencing, Sophia stood on the construction site of what would become the Connor Sterling Memorial Children's Hospital, a $50 million project funded by the Sterling Mitchell Foundation. She'd named it for her son, not because anything had happened to him, but because he'd been the catalyst for everything that followed. Connor, now an energetic 3-year-old, wore a tiny hard hat and safety vest as he helped the construction workers pour concrete for the foundation. The workers indulged him with good humor, letting him operate toy trucks while they handled the real machinery. "Mama, I'm building," Connor announced proudly, dumping a load of dirt from his truck. "Yes, you are," Sophia replied, kneeling down to his level. "What are you building?" "A hop steel for sick babies, so they get better like I did." The innocence of his answer brought tears to her eyes. Connor didn't remember being in the hospital, didn't remember his father's abandonment, didn't remember the fear that had nearly consumed their lives. He only knew that his mother built hospitals and schools, that she helped people, and that he was loved unconditionally. Rick Davidson approached with a tablet showing the latest quarterly reports. Sterling Mitchell Properties had become one of the most respected construction companies in the Northeast, known for projects that served communities rather than exploiting them. "The numbers are incredible," Rick said. 30% growth, industry-leading safety ratings, and a waiting list of clients who want to work with us. Jackson would have never achieved anything like this. "Jackson measured success differently," Sophia replied, watching Connor play. "He thought bigger meant better. We've learned that better means better." Agent Chen joined them, now a friend rather than just a law enforcement contact. "I wanted to update you on Jackson's status. He's been moved to medium security after good behavior, his lawyers floating the possibility of early release in 12 years. Sophia felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Even after all this time, the thought of Jackson's eventual freedom made her nervous. "How do you feel about that?" Agent Chen asked. "Honestly, I hope he gets out and finds a way to build a decent life, not for his sake, but for Connor's. Someday, my son is going to ask about his father, and I'd rather tell him that people can change than that they can't." Elena Martinez had retired from active practice but still consulted on the foundation's legal matters. She'd often told Sophia that the Sterling case had been the most satisfying of her career, not because they'd destroyed a powerful man, but because they'd given power to someone who would use it responsibly. "You know what I'm proudest of," Elena had said recently. "Connor will grow up in a world where his mother is CEO Sterling, where women run companies and make decisions and fight for what's right. That's worth more than any settlement." As the afternoon wore on, Sophia found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. It had started with Jackson's dismissive words, "It's just a baby," and a fevered child in a hospital bed. Now Connor was healthy and happy, surrounded by people who valued his worth and his mother's strength. The children's hospital would open in 18 months, providing medical care for families who couldn't afford private health care. The architectural firm Sophia had quietly launched was designing schools and community centers across 3 states. The foundation was funding scholarships for children whose parents worked in construction, ensuring the next generation would have opportunities Jackson had never cared about creating. "Mama, look," Connor called out, pointing to a crane lifting steel beams into place. "It's going up high like Daddy's building." Sophia's breath caught. Connor had no memories of visiting Jackson's offices, but somehow he'd retained an image of tall buildings and his father. It was the first time he'd mentioned Jackson in months. "Yes, baby, but this building is different. This one helps people get better, like when I was sick." "Exactly like that." Connor nodded solemnly, then returned to his toy trucks. For him, it was just another day at Mommy's worksite. For Sophia, it was a reminder that the past never truly disappeared. It just transformed into something else. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Collins. "Saw the news about the hospital groundbreaking. Connor's lucky to have a mother who turns pain into purpose." As the sun set over the construction site, Sophia picked up Connor and headed toward their car. Tomorrow there would be budget meetings and design reviews and the 1,000 details that went into building something lasting. But tonight, there would be dinner and bath time and bedtime stories about little engines that could overcome any obstacle. Jackson Sterling had built an empire based on taking from others. Sophia Sterling was building a legacy based on giving back. Both approaches created powerful forces in the world, but only one created the kind of power that lasted. Connor fell asleep in his car seat during the drive home, his small face peaceful in the fading light. Sophia glanced at him in the rearview mirror and smiled. He would never be just a baby. To anyone who knew him, he was Connor Sterling, son of a woman who'd refused to accept that anyone was just anything. The empire she'd built from the ruins of her marriage wasn't made of steel and glass. It was made of integrity, determination, and the unshakable belief that every life had infinite worth. It was the kind of foundation that could support any dream her son might choose to build upon it. And that was a legacy worth fighting for. Sometimes the most powerful empires rise from the ashes of our deepest betrayals. Sophia Sterling's journey from dismissed housewife to respected CEO reminds us that our greatest strength often emerges when we're forced to defend what matters most. In a world that too often reduces people to just something, she proved that everyone, especially those who seem most vulnerable, has the power to reshape their destiny. What would you have done in Sophia's position? Share your thoughts below, and remember, you're never just anything.